The Andes Mountains were draped in a white veil. The snowstorm had arrived unexpectedly that morning, turning familiar trails into a treacherous labyrinth. For Miguel, this was nothing new. As a mountain guide, he knew that nature could be unpredictable. Waking to the sound of howling wind, Miguel remembered that the previous afternoon, he had left some of his gear at the foot of the mountain after helping a group of tourists descend safely. He knew the snow would quickly bury everything, and losing that equipment would be a significant blow to his modest income. Despite the looming danger, he decided to venture out and retrieve it before it was too late. "Just a quick walk," he muttered, pulling on his heavy wool jacket and sturdy boots. As he made his way down the trail, the wind cut like blades, and the snow fell mercilessly, covering every step he took. Miguel constantly adjusted his hood, narrowing his eyes as he searched for landmarks. With years of experience, he knew that losing one's sense of direction in such conditions could be fatal. Nearing the spot where he had left his gear, something unusual caught his attention. There were footprints in the snow, partially covered by the storm. They were small and erratic, as if the person had been walking in circles, lost. Who would be out here in a storm like this? He asked himself, a chill running down his spine that wasn't from the weather. Miguel followed the footprints until he spotted a silhouette in the distance, barely visible through the whiteout. Approaching cautiously, he saw it was a woman. She was kneeling, her arms crossed over her chest, shivering violently. Her dark hair was soaked, clinging to her pale face, and her clothing was entirely unsuitable for the conditions. A thin jacket and lightweight pants, now completely drenched. "Hey, are you okay?" Miguel shouted, but the wind carried his voice away. He quickened his pace, fearing the worst. When he reached her, he saw her lips were blue, and her half-closed eyes had a dull glaze, clear signs that hypothermia had already set in. "Don't worry, I'll get you out of here," he said, taking off his own coat to wrap around her. The woman tried to mumble something, but her voice was too faint to be heard. Miguel knew he had to act quickly. He carefully lifted her into his arms, ignoring the weight and the wind that seemed determined to knock him down. "Hold on, my cabin isn't far," he said, more to himself than to her, as he pushed forward along the trail, now disappearing under the snow. What was usually a 20-minute journey felt like an eternity. The wind battered his face like 1,000 needles, and his feet sank deep into the snow with every step, making it hard to keep his balance. But Miguel didn't give up. Every time he felt the woman's body grow heavier, he fought the urge to stop, knowing her survival depended on his strength. Finally, he spotted the cabin in the distance. His legs nearly buckled with relief, but he summoned the last of his energy to reach it. With a kick, he forced the door open and laid the woman near the fireplace. Wasting no time, he lit the fire, removed her soaked shoes and socks, and wrapped her in a thick blanket. Then he rushed to the kitchen to prepare a hot drink to warm her from the inside. "Drink this. It'll help," he said, bringing the mug to her lips. The woman took small sips, still trembling, but her breathing began to steady. Eventually, she opened her eyes, looking directly at Miguel. "Thank you," she murmured before closing her eyes again, exhausted. Miguel watched her, feeling a mix of relief and curiosity. Who was this woman, and what was she doing alone in such a dangerous storm? The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire began to chase away the deadly cold that clung to her. Miguel stayed by her side, monitoring her every movement. He knew that hypothermia didn't vanish quickly. It required patience and care. The woman was still trembling, but color slowly returned to her cheeks. Miguel dampened a clean cloth with warm water and gently wiped her face, removing the remaining dirt and snow. "You're safe now," he murmured, more to reassure her than to expect a response. After a few hours, she began to stir. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking several times as she adjusted to the soft glow of the firelight. For a moment, she seemed disoriented, but soon her expression shifted to one of relief mixed with confusion. Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "You're in my cabin," Miguel replied, his tone calm and reassuring. "I found you on the trail. You were almost frozen." She tried to sit up but groaned in pain. Miguel quickly placed a hand on her shoulder, encouraging her to lie back down. Don't push yourself. You're still weak. The woman nodded, taking a deep breath. After a few seconds, she looked at him with a mix of gratitude and surprise. You saved me. I just did what anyone would do, Miguel said, modestly averting his gaze. But what were you doing out there alone in the storm? She hesitated, as though the words were difficult to find. I got lost. I was trying to reach the nearest village, but the snow started falling too fast. My car got stuck on a curve, and I guess I panicked. I started walking, thinking I'd find help, but her voice trailed off, and she closed her eyes briefly, trying to compose herself. Miguel listened attentively. He had seen inexperienced tourists lose their way before, but something about the way she spoke suggested her situation was different. He didn't press her, respecting her silence. Well, you're safe now. Rest a bit more, he said, rising to prepare a hot soup. As the soup simmered over the fire, Miguel couldn't help but wonder who this woman was. Her clothes, though unsuitable for the mountains, were from expensive brands. She carried an air of sophistication, but also a vulnerability that contrasted with her refined appearance. Here, eat some of this. It'll help you regain your strength, Miguel said, handing her a steaming bowl. She accepted it with still trembling hands and took small spoonfuls, as though each bite was an effort. After finishing, she looked at Miguel, her eyes shining with sincerity. I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't found me, don't think about that now, Miguel interrupted with a soft smile. What matters is that you're alive. She smiled back for the first time since she'd woken up. My name is Camila, she said after a brief pause. And you? Miguel. I'm a mountain guide around here. I help tourists explore the trails. Camila nodded, as if the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. She glanced around, taking in the simple yet cozy details of the cabin. It was a humble place, but full of personality. Old photographs on the walls, neatly organized mountain gear in one corner, and a large map hanging beside the fireplace. Your home is cozy, she said genuinely. It's all I need, Miguel replied with a slight smile. For a moment, the two sat in silence, listening only to the crackling of the fire. For Miguel, the mountain silence had always been comforting, but today he felt something different, as though this unexpected encounter held a deeper meaning he couldn't yet grasp. Finally, Camila sighed and leaned back under the blanket. Her eyes grew heavy again, and Miguel let her rest without asking more questions. He knew the answers would come in time. Dawn broke with a clear, cloudless sky, as if the storm had never existed. The snow that had fiercely fallen now blanketed the landscape in a serene, silent white. Inside the cabin, the gentle sunlight filtered through the small windows, illuminating Camila's serene face as she slept. Miguel had been up for a while. He had stoked the fire, brewed fresh coffee, and mentally reviewed his tasks for the day. His routine was simple yet purposeful, checking the trails, ensuring the safety of tourists, and, if possible, earning a little money by guiding small groups through the mountains. While rummaging through an old backpack, separating ropes and flashlights, Miguel cast a glance at Camila. She looked more rested now, her complexion regaining a healthy tone. Still, he knew that her recovery would take time, both physically and emotionally. Camila stirred shortly after, stretching slowly. When she saw Miguel, she gave a timid smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice still hoarse. "Good morning. How are you feeling?" "Better. A bit sore but alive." Miguel chuckled, relieved. "That's what matters." After sipping the coffee Miguel offered her, Camila began to explore the cabin with her eyes, noticing details she hadn't seen before. On the wall, black and white photos showed Miguel as a young man beside an older man, probably his father. There were also pictures of smiling groups of tourists posing at breathtaking viewpoints. "Have you been doing this for a long time?" she asked, pointing to the photos. "Since I can remember," Miguel replied with a nostalgic smile. "My father was a guide before me. He taught me everything about the mountains. It must be amazing to know a place like this so well," Camila said, her voice tinged with admiration. "It is. The mountains are my home, but they can be dangerous too." Yesterday was proof of that. Camila nodded, her gaze becoming thoughtful. I should never have left the car. Miguel heard the regret in her voice, but chose not to push further. The important thing is that you're here now. If you need a few more days to recover, you can stay. The cabin is simple, but it'll keep you warm. Camila smiled gratefully, though Miguel sensed something more in her expression. Perhaps a sense of indebtedness or something deeper she wasn't ready to share. After ensuring that Camila was comfortable, Miguel decided to head out and inspect the damage the storm might have caused on the trails. He knew many tourists ignored weather conditions, and as a guide, it was his duty to ensure everyone's safety. I'll be back soon, he said, pulling on his coat. If you need anything, the kettle's on the stove, and there's fresh bread on the shelf. Camila nodded, watching as he left. As soon as the door closed, the silence of the cabin felt heavier. Miguel descended the trail with firm steps, his mind divided between the day's tasks and the woman he had rescued. He was used to helping lost people, but something about Camila intrigued him. Her presence seemed to bring a new energy to his solitary routine. As he checked the trails, he found small signs of the storm, broken branches, displaced rocks, and animal tracks from the night before. He repaired what he could and made mental notes to return later with tools. The soft sound of the wind and the fresh scent of snow were comforting. For Miguel, being in the mountains felt like being at peace with himself. It was where he felt most alive, connected to something greater. When he returned to the cabin in the early afternoon, he found Camila at the small table with a map spread out before her. She looked up, her lips forming a slightly embarrassed smile. I hope you don't mind. I was curious about the trails. Miguel laughed, hanging up his coat. I don't mind. In fact, I'm happy to explain. This is my territory, he said, approaching the table. He began pointing out the trails on the map, explaining each turn, each dangerous spot, and every breathtaking view that tourists loved. Camila listened intently, her eyes shining with interest. You really love this, don't you? She asked after a while. Yes, the mountains are a part of me. Camila seemed to reflect on this, her finger tracing the map's lines. Maybe it's time I found something like that too, she murmured, more to herself than to Miguel. Miguel didn't respond, but he sensed there was much more to Camila than she was willing to reveal at the moment. Something about the mountains, or perhaps about Miguel himself, seemed to be awakening a new perspective within her. Over the following days, Camila regained her strength while Miguel maintained his simple routine, heading out each morning to explore the trails and check the paths. Yet, every time he returned to the cabin, he found himself strangely eager to see Camila. Her presence made the space feel warmer, as though his usual solitude had been replaced by a companionship he hadn't realized he was missing. Camila, meanwhile, slowly began to open up. She told Miguel she was a businesswoman, the owner of a luxury hotel chain, and that she had come to the mountains to escape the stress of city life. I've never had time for myself, she admitted one evening as they sipped tea by the fireplace. My life has always been dedicated to work, but getting lost in that storm made me realize I was more lost inside than out. Miguel listened intently, his eyes fixed on her. Sometimes the mountains give us more than answers. They give us a new beginning, he said softly. Camila smiled, as though those words carried a weight she finally understood. Maybe that's why fate brought me to you. The silence that followed was filled with unspoken meaning, deeply felt by both. On a particularly cold night, Camila and Miguel decided to cook together. He taught her a simple recipe for Andean soup, and they laughed when Camila accidentally spilled part of the broth. I don't think I'm cut out for mountain life, she joked as she cleaned up the mess. You're doing better than many tourists I've guided, Miguel replied with a laugh. As the night wore on, their conversation grew deeper. Miguel spoke about his father, who had passed away years earlier, and how he had dedicated his life to protecting the mountains and helping those who ventured into them. He always said the mountains reveal who we really are, Miguel recounted, his gaze lost in the flames of the fireplace. Camila, visibly moved, reached out to touch his hand. And what have they revealed about you? She asked softly. Miguel looked at her, surprised by her closeness. That even alone, I've always had everything I needed. But now, he hesitated, as if the words were hard to say. Maybe I'm discovering there's something more I want, Camila's gaze locked with his, and in that moment, the silence between them spoke louder than any words. That same night, as Camila prepared to sleep, Miguel called her outside. The storm had left the sky crystal clear, and a million stars sparkled above the mountains. "It's beautiful," Camila murmured, enchanted by the sight. "I always come here when I need clarity," Miguel said, standing beside her. They stood in silence, contemplating the vast sky. Then, Camila turned to Miguel, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Thank you for everything. For saving me, for listening to me, and for showing me what really matters." Miguel felt his heart race. He raised a hand and gently touched her face. "You don't need to thank me. I just followed what my heart told me to do." Camila smiled, and before either of them could overthink, their faces drew closer. The kiss was soft, yet filled with emotion, as if they had both been waiting for this moment without realizing it. In the days that followed, Miguel and Camila spent more and more time together. Camila, captivated by the simplicity of mountain life, began to consider how she could incorporate that peace into her hectic lifestyle. Before leaving, she made an unexpected proposal. "Miguel, I want you to help me create something special here. A retreat in the mountains for people like me who need to reconnect with themselves. I want you to be my partner in this." Miguel was surprised but didn't take long to respond. "If it means you'll be around, I accept." They both smiled, and in that moment, they knew they had found more than a project. They had found each other. Together, they would create not just a refuge for travelers, but also one for their own hearts. The mountains, as always, remained the great guardians of their stories, proving that even amidst the most violent storms, beauty and hope await discovery.